For months, she had quietly fixed their broken ledges, saved their failing homesteads, and kept half the ranches in this county from going under. But in Caldwell Creek, a woman's worth wasn't measured by what she saved. It was measured by what she looked like. And Margaret Doyle, the town made sure she knew she didn't fit their picture. They laughed behind her back, called her plain, whispered cruel jokes over the dry goods counter, and treated her like a burden even as she handed them their salvation on a silver platter. She took every whisper in silence. She swallowed the humiliation because she believed work spoke louder than cruelty. But the town mistook her quiet dignity for weakness. They thought they could mock her, shame her, and break her spirit without a consequence in the world. And then there was Ethan Walker, the lonely, broken mountain man who hadn't spoken a kind word to anyone in 5 years, a man the entire town whispered about and secretly feared. Everyone knew Ethan kept his distance from everyone. Everyone knew he didn't care about the town's petty games. So when Margaret walked straight through the laughing crowd, past the whispering women, and stood right in front of the most isolated man in Montana to confess something no one expected, the entire square went dead silent. The town expected Ethan to turn her away, to join in their mockery, to put the plain woman in her place. What Ethan did next didn't just shatter their cruel laughter, it shocked everyone to their core. Because the man who supposedly cared for no one stepped forward, looked the laughing town straight in the eye, and did something that changed the rules forever. If this story makes your blood boil and your heart race, hit subscribe, stay until the very end, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now, let's begin. 8 weeks before the square went silent, the summer heat in Caldwell Creek felt thick enough to choke on. The annual livestock fair was in full swing, a chaotic swirl of cattle dust, shouting merchants, and the heavy smell of roasted corn and dried sweat. It was the social event of the season, the one day a year where everyone in the territory gathered to trade, to boast, and most importantly, to judge. Margaret Doyle sat in the back of a halted freight wagon, the wooden boards digging into her spine. She was 31 years old, a professional accountant whose previous employer in Helena had died suddenly, leaving her completely alone in a territory that had very little use for a woman who lived by numbers. Her plain cotton dress was stiff with road dust. A dark smear of wagon grease stained her left cuff. Her light brown hair, pulled back into a severe, practical bun, offered no softening to a face that the world had long ago deemed unappealing. She climbed down from the wagon, adjusting the strap of her heavy leather satchel. She did not ask for a hand down. She had learned early in life that men rarely offered their hands to women who looked like her, unless they were demanding payment. As her boots hit the dirt, she immediately felt the weight of it, the specific, suffocating atmosphere of a small frontier town's scrutiny. Less than 10 yards away, a cluster of women stood beneath a shaded awning, waving lace fans to combat the heat. Margaret recognized the type instantly. They were the arbiters of Caldwell Creek's social hierarchy. "Good heavens," one of them, a sharply dressed woman named Clara Hennessy, murmured just loud enough to ensure it carried over the noise of the cattle pens. "Did that come in with the freight, or did someone forget to sweep out the stables?" A low ripple of laughter followed. Another, her woman, Mildred Paxton, adjusted her bonnet and cast a sweeping, dismissive glance over Margaret's dusty hem and unremarkable face. "It's a pity," Mildred said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "Some women are just born to be invisible. You'd think she'd at least try to present herself. Look at her face, plain as a wooden plank." Margaret kept her chin level. She did not flush. She did not look away. She simply gripped the leather handle of her satchel a fraction tighter, her knuckles turning white. She had been hearing variations of those exact words since she was 12 years old. Plain, ugly, unwanted. The world had repeatedly told her that because she possessed no delicate beauty, no captivating smile, and no soft charm, she was essentially worthless as a woman. She swallowed the familiar, jagged lump in her throat. She was not here to win a beauty contest. She was here because she had exactly $3 left to her name, and her unparalleled skill with a ledger was the only thing standing between her and starvation. Margaret adjusted her practical sun hat, picked a direction, and began to walk. As she moved through the fairground, scanning the merchants and ranchers for anyone who might need bookkeeping, she noticed something peculiar about the financial transactions happening around her. A grain merchant was shortchanging a desperate young farmer using a rigged scale. Two cattle brokers were shaking hands on a deal that, based on the quick mental math Margaret performed, was designed to bankrupt one of them within the year. The town was bleeding money through sheer incompetence and unchecked greed. Yet the people were too busy judging each other's appearances to notice their own impending ruin. And then she saw him. A crowd has a strange way of shaping itself around a center of gravity. Near the cattle auction, the bustling tide of people seemed to part, creating a wide, empty circle around one specific man. Ethan Walker stood by the wooden fence with his arms crossed over a worn brown wool vest. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and weathered by the brutal Montana winters. His steel-gray eyes stared straight ahead, fixed on a point in the distance, entirely disconnected from the noise around him. He radiated a dangerous, immovable stillness. He was the kind of man who looked like he had survived a war and had decided never to lower his weapons again. Margaret stood near a lemonade stand, watching him. For the past 20 minutes, she had seen at least 4 different young, beautiful women attempt to approach him. Each one wore her finest dress, flashing practiced smiles, offering baked goods or fluttering their eyelashes. And each one was met with the exact same response, a flat, dead-eyed stare that offered no warmth, no welcome, and absolutely no mercy. He didn't even speak. He just looked at them until they withered under his silence and retreated in embarrassment. "Don't even think about it," a voice said beside Margaret. Margaret turned to see the lemonade vendor, an older man with missing teeth, shaking his head. "That's Ethan Walker. Man's been a ghost for 5 years. His bride left him 3 days before the wedding, ran off with a banker because Walker was too harsh, too wild, broke him in half. Now he runs the biggest ranch in the county and hates every living soul in this town, especially the women." Margaret looked back at Ethan. The vendor saw a broken, bitter man. The town women saw a wealthy, frightening challenge. But Margaret, who had spent her entire life observing what others ignored, saw something else entirely. She saw the rigid tension in his jaw. She saw the way his shoulders braced every time someone laughed nearby. He wasn't arrogant. He was building a fortress. He despised the town's superficiality just as much as she suffered from it. Margaret looked down at her grease-stained cuff, then up at the intimidating, silent cowboy. She didn't have a perfect face. She didn't have a lattice-crust pie, but she had a leather satchel full of numbers and a sudden, undeniable instinct that the most isolated man in Montana was bleeding out financially and didn't even know it. Taking a slow, steady breath, Margaret Doyle tightened her grip on her satchel and stepped directly into the circle of empty space surrounding him. Margaret's boots kicked up small clouds of dust as she closed the distance. The murmurs from the women under the awning grew louder, a chorus of sharp, mocking whispers. Clara Hennessy's voice carried on the hot breeze, carrying the precise cruelty that only bored, privileged women could muster. Look at her. She actually thinks she has a chance. A stray dog begging for a scrap. Ethan Walker saw her coming. His jaw tightened, preparing the same impenetrable wall of dead-eyed silence he used to break the spirits of the local belles. He watched her approach, taking in the dust-stained hem, the severe bun, and the complete absence of a desperate, fluttering smile. When she stopped 2 feet away, she did not bat her eyelashes. She did not offer him a compliment. "Excuse me, Mr. Walker," Margaret said. Her voice was level, devoid of any performative sweetness. "I'm Margaret Doyle, and based on the whispers I've been analyzing for the last 20 minutes, you are losing approximately 15% of your seasonal revenue, and you have absolutely no idea why." Ethan blinked. For the first time in 5 years, the blank mask slipped. He stared down at this small, plain woman who was looking at him not as a conquest, but as a ledger that didn't balance. "I beg your pardon?" His voice was a low, gravelly rumble, rusted from disuse. "I am a professional accountant," Margaret continued, unfazed by the sheer intimidation of his size. "I have references, though they are currently in Helena. Your name came up 3 times while I was asking around about available bookkeeping work. Each time the person mentioning your ranch looked entirely too smug. In my professional experience, when suppliers look smug, the rancher is being robbed." Before Ethan could process the sheer audacity of her statement, a heavy body shoved roughly past Margaret's shoulder, nearly knocking her off balance. "Out of the way, homely," slurred a broad-chested cattle hand smelling heavily of whiskey and stale sweat. He sneered down at Margaret, intentionally stepping on the hem of her dress with a muddy boot. "The man ain't looking for a scarecrow to put in his fields. Go peddle your ugly mug somewhere else before you scare the livestock." Margaret stumbled, her knuckles turning white around the handle of her satchel, bracing herself for the dirt and the inevitable roar of laughter from the watching women. But she never hit the ground. Ethan Walker moved with terrifying speed. A massive, calloused hand shot out, clamping around the cattle hand's collar with bone-crushing force. He hauled the man backward, placing his own broad-shouldered frame deliberately and solidly between Margaret and the drunk. The entire fairground seemed to hold its breath. Ethan didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He simply leaned in, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper that sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. "You step on her dress again, and I'll break the leg you used to do it. Now walk away." The drunk swallowed hard, the color draining from his face. He scrambled backward, disappearing into the crowd without another word. The whispering women under the awning had frozen, their fans stalled in midair. Ethan Walker, the man who hadn't touched another human being in kindness or defense in half a decade, had just physically shielded the plainest woman in the territory. Ethan turned back to Margaret. He looked at her dust-caked boots, the grease on her cuff, and a fierce, unyielding dignity in her brown eyes. She wasn't crying, she wasn't blushing, she was just waiting for his answer about the ledgers. "You have your tools in that bag, Miss Doyle?" Ethan asked, his voice returning to its flat, controlled baseline, though the tension in his broad shoulders remained. "I do. My wagon is out back," Ethan said. "Let's see if you're as good with numbers as you are at holding your ground." The ride to the Walker Ranch was conducted in silence. The golden prairies stretched out around them, vast and indifferent, the air cooling as the sun dipped toward the horizon. When they arrived, Margaret was shown into the study by Agnes, a stout, suspicious housekeeper who looked Margaret up and down, but mercifully kept her judgments to herself. The study was a sanctuary of dark timber, smelling of old paper and leather. Ethan dropped 7 years of thick, leather-bound ledgers onto the heavy oak desk. "Show me," he said. Margaret didn't waste time on pleasantries. She lit the brass oil lamp, sat at the desk, and opened her satchel. For the next 3 hours, the only sounds in the room were the scratching of her pencil and the turning of pages. Ethan sat in the corner chair, watching her. He was mesmerized, though he would never admit it, by the utter lack of performance in her posture. She wasn't trying to angle her face to catch the light. She wasn't sighing to draw his attention. She was just doing the work, her mind a steel trap closing around his financial ruin. Around midnight, Margaret stopped. She set her pencil down with a soft click. "I found it," she said quietly. Ethan stood and crossed the room, leaning over her shoulder to look at the numbers she had meticulously cross-referenced. "Your grain supplier, Harlan & Sons, has been overcharging you for 18 months, Margaret explained, her finger tracing the columns. "But Harlan couldn't do it alone. The delivery receipts have all been signed and authorized by someone on the inside, someone who is taking a cut to look the other way." Ethan's jaw hardened as he read the signature at the bottom of the forged receipts. "Tom Briggs, my foreman. He's been with me for 6 years. "I am sorry, Mr. Walker," Margaret said, her voice gentle but firm. "The numbers do not lie." Ethan stood straight, staring into the dark corner of the room. The betrayal was a fresh wound on top of old scars. "I need to check the south pasture lines. Stay here. Don't mention this to anyone yet." He left the study, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. Margaret exhaled, rubbing her tired eyes. She stood to stretch her aching back, walking toward the hallway to fetch a glass of water from the kitchen. As she stepped into the dim corridor, a heavy hand clamped over her forearm, shoving her roughly against the timber wall. It was Tom Briggs. The foreman's face was twisted in a vicious sneer, smelling of the same stale whiskey as the men at the fair. He had been listening at the window. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Briggs hissed, his grip bruising her arm, leaning in so close she could feel the heat of his anger. "You think the boss is going to take the word of a plain, ugly stray over his own foreman? You listen to me. You tear those pages out, or by tomorrow morning, I'll tell the whole town you offered to warm his bed for a job. They already think you're pathetic. I'll make sure they run you out of this county covered in tar." Margaret stared up at him, her heart hammered against her ribs, the old familiar terror of public humiliation rearing its head. She was alone in a strange house, threatened by a desperate, dangerous man, and the only person who could save her was a broken cowboy, who owed her nothing. Margaret's stare read up at Tom Briggs, her back pressed hard against the rough timber wall of the hallway. The smell of stale whiskey and sweat was suffocating, and the bruising pressure of his fingers on her arm sent sharp spikes of pain up to her shoulder. For a fleeting second, the old, familiar terror gripped her, the conditioned fear of a woman who had been told her whole life that she was too plain, too small, and too unwanted to ever matter. But as Briggs glared down at her, expecting tears, expecting the fragile surrender of a broken woman, something else ignited inside Margaret. It wasn't physical strength. It was the unyielding cold steel of mathematical certainty. "You can drag me into the town square," Margaret said, her voice dropping to a low, remarkably steady whisper. She didn't blink. "You can tell them I threw myself at him. You can let them laugh at my face and my dress. But mathematics does not care about my face, Mr. Briggs. The numbers in that ledger are a matter of public record the moment they are taken to a territorial judge. You didn't just steal from Ethan Walker. You committed federal wire fraud across territory lines by forging those supply manifests. So go ahead, ruin my reputation. It won't save you from a prison cell." Briggs's eyes widened, his sneer faltering. For a second, he looked less like a threatening predator and more like a cornered rat. He raised his free hand, curling it into a fist, a desperate, violent impulse taking over. "You ugly little, take your hand off her." The voice didn't echo. It didn't need to. It cut through the dim hallway like the crack of a bullwhip, so cold and heavy with promised violence that Briggs froze instantly. From the shadows near the back door, Ethan Walker stepped into the light of the oil lamp. He hadn't gone to the south pasture. He had been standing outside the window, listening. Briggs immediately released Margaret's arm, taking a frantic step backward. "Boss, wait, you don't understand. This woman, she's..." Ethan didn't let him finish. He closed the distance in 2 long strides, his large hand snapping out to grip Briggs by the throat. With a terrifying, effortless surge of strength, the mountain man slammed his own foreman against the opposite wall. The timber groaned under the impact. "I heard every word," Ethan said, his voice a low, lethal gravel. His steel-gray eyes were devoid of any mercy. "You stole from my land. You took my money. But what you are not going to do is put your hands on my accountant, and you are sure as hell not going to speak to her like that in my house." "Ethan, please," Briggs gasped, clawing at the massive hand pinning his windpipe. With his free hand, Ethan reached down and smoothly slid the heavy Colt revolver from Briggs's holster, tossing it onto the floorboards with a heavy thud. "Pack your bags. You have 5 minutes to get off my property. If I ever see you within a 10-mile radius of Caldwell Creek, or if I hear a single whisper of her name come out of your mouth in town, I won't bother calling the sheriff. Do we understand each other?" Briggs nodded frantically, his face turning a mottled purple. Ethan released him in disgust. The foreman slumped against the wall, coughing, before scrambling toward the bunkhouse without looking back. The hallway fell dead silent. The only sound was the wind rattling the heavy wooden shutters of the ranch house. Margaret stood frozen, her hand rubbing the bruised skin of her forearm. Her heart was beating frantically against her ribs, the adrenaline finally crashing down on her. She tried to steady her breathing, desperately willing herself not to show weakness. She was used to men looking away from her. She was used to being invisible. Having a man like Ethan Walker, a man the whole territory feared, stand up for her with such explosive, unfiltered protection was profoundly disorienting. Ethan turned to her. The lethal, cold fury in his eyes vanished the moment he looked at her face. He saw the faint trembling of her fingers, the pale shock in her cheeks. He didn't ask if she was all right. He knew she wasn't. Without a word, he walked into the kitchen. He returned a moment later with a tin cup of cool well water. He offered it to her, his large, calloused hands remarkably steady. "Drink," he said quietly. Margaret took the cup, her fingers brushing against his rough skin. "Thank you," she managed to say, her voice slightly raw. She took a sip, the cold water grounding her. She looked down at her dusty boots, suddenly hyper-aware of how plain and disheveled she must look. "I apologize for the disturbance. I should have waited until morning to bring the ledgers to you." "You did exactly what you were supposed to do," Ethan said. He leaned against the wall, crossing his arms, watching her with that intense, unreadable gaze. He didn't look at her like she was an ugly duckling. He looked at her like she was the most valuable thing in the room. Briggs was right about one thing. The town is going to talk. When they find out a woman is running my books, especially a woman who doesn't care to play their social games, they will tear into you. Margaret lifted her chin, the soft oval of her face setting into a mask of quiet iron. "I have been laughed at my entire life, Mr. Walker. I survived Helena. I can survive the gossip of Caldwell Creek. I just need to know if you want me to fix your accounts or not." A faint, almost imperceptible shift happened in Ethan's rigid posture. It was the closest thing to respect she had ever seen a man give her. "The spare room is at the end of the hall," Ethan said softly. "Agnes put fresh linens on the bed. Lock the door. No one comes into this house without my say-so. Tomorrow, you have full authority over the ledgers." For the next 2 weeks, the Walker Ranch transformed. Margaret worked with a relentless, mechanical efficiency, tearing apart the fraudulent contracts, recovering stolen funds, and restructuring the cattle pricing. Agnes, the stern housekeeper who initially viewed Margaret with deep suspicion, slowly began leaving extra biscuits and hot coffee on the desk, recognizing the undeniable salvation the quiet, unadorned woman was bringing to the failing ranch. Ethan watched her. He watched her work through lunch. He watched how her brow furrowed when the numbers refused to balance. And most importantly, he watched how she flinched whenever a sudden, loud shout came from the ranch hands outside. It was a subtle, heartbreaking flinch. The flinch of a woman who had spent a lifetime waiting for someone to shout a cruel joke at her expense. It made a dark, protective anger coil deep in his chest. The peace of the ranch, however, was shattered on a Tuesday morning. A polished black carriage rolled into the dusty yard, entirely out of place among the working wagons. Out stepped Charles Whitmore, a man whose expensive suit and slick, calculating smile practically oozed predatory intent. He was a land investor from back east, and for months he had been circling Caldwell Creek like a vulture, buying up struggling ranches for pennies on the dollar. Ethan met him on the porch, his posture radiating hostility. Margaret, hearing the commotion, stepped out of the study, holding a stack of revised contracts. "Walker," Whitmore said, flashing a greasy smile, his eyes darting around the property. "I heard about your foreman. A shame. It must be devastating for your operations. I've come to make this easy for you. I'm offering to buy the Walker Ranch. A generous price considering your current financial distress. Whitmore extended a folded piece of paper. Ethan didn't take it. Instead, Margaret stepped forward, her plain dress brushing the porch boards. She took the paper from Whitmore's extended hand. Whitmore blinked, staring at her as if a piece of furniture had suddenly spoken. Margaret scanned the numbers on the paper. A cold, sharp smile touched her lips. A smile that had absolutely nothing to do with being pretty and everything to do with being deadly. "This offer isn't generous, Mr. Whitmore," Margaret said, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "It's extortion. You are offering 20 cents on the dollar because you assume Mr. Walker is drowning in debt. Furthermore, your valuation deliberately ignores the upcoming Northern Pacific Railroad expansion, which will run directly through the South Pasture in 18 months. Factoring in the corrected supplier contracts I finalized yesterday, the Walker Ranch is not in distress. It is operating at a 14% surplus." Whitmore's smile vanished. His face flushed a dark, angry red as he stared at the small, unadorned woman holding his ruined scheme in her hands. He sneered, his eyes raking over her plain face and dusty hem with unmistakable disgust. "And who exactly are you?" Whitmore spat, his voice dripping with venom. "Did Walker hire a scullery maid to read his mail? Or is this the kind of cheap entertainment he keeps around, since no decent woman in town will look at him?" Ethan stepped off the porch, the air dropping 10 degrees. "Her name is Margaret Doyle," Ethan said, standing shoulder to shoulder with her, his massive frame dwarfing Whitmore's. "She is my financial manager, and she just told you to get off my land. I suggest you listen before I throw you off it." Whitmore took a step back toward his carriage, his pride stinging. He pointed a gloved finger at Ethan, but his furious eyes were fixed on Margaret. "You think you've won because of some math done by a spinster?" Whitmore hissed. "The town council meets on Friday to discuss the communal grazing rights. If you don't sell to me, I'll make sure every merchant in Caldwell Creek calls in your debts. Let's see how much your precious, ugly little accountant can save you when the whole town turns against you." Whitmore climbed into his carriage and sped away, leaving a cloud of dust in his wake. Margaret stood on the porch, the word "ugly" ringing in her ears like a physical blow. The old wound throbbed, threatening to pull her back into the shadows. But then Ethan's hand, large and impossibly warm, gently touched her shoulder. "He's a dead man walking," Ethan said quietly, his thumb brushing the fabric of her sleeve. "Let him talk to the town. We'll be ready." For the next 3 days, the study of the Walker Ranch became Margaret Doyle's first true sanctuary. Enclosed by thick timber walls and the comforting, predictable scent of old leather and ink, she immersed herself in the ledgers. Mathematics was a world where logic reigned absolute, a place where a woman's worth was determined by the precision of her mind, not the symmetry of her face. Ethan Walker spent those 3 days in a quiet, intense state of observation. He had always been a man who noticed things: the shift in the wind before a blizzard, the subtle limp of a horse, the unspoken tensions among his ranch hands. Now, all that fierce, silent attention was fixed on the small woman sitting at his desk. He noticed that she never looked in the mirror hanging near the coat rack. He noticed how her shoulders instinctively hunched, pulling inward to make herself as small and invisible as possible whenever she had to walk across the busy ranch yard. But the most damning observation came on a Thursday afternoon. A group of ranch hands resting near the barn burst into a loud, raucous fit of laughter over a joke. In the study, Ethan saw Margaret's pencil snap in half. She flinched, too violently that she nearly knocked over the inkwell. Her breath hitched, her eyes darting toward the window, her body bracing for the inevitable cruelty she assumed was directed at her. It took her several long, agonizing seconds to realize the laughter had nothing to do with her. She closed her eyes, trembling slightly, and reached for a new pencil. Standing in the doorway, Ethan felt a dark, heavy knot twist in his gut. He had spent 5 years hiding from the town because their superficiality disgusted him. But Margaret hadn't hidden. She had been forced to stand in the center of their cruel, judging world, absorbing their mockery day after day, year after year. The town had beaten her down with whispers, yet she still possessed the iron spine to look Charles Whitmore in the eye and tell him to go to hell. "We need to go into town," Ethan said, breaking the silence. Margaret looked up, her expression immediately settling into its professional mask. "To Caldwell Creek? Mr. Whitmore threatened to call in your debts. We should pull the official grazing land deeds from the county clerk to ensure he doesn't have a legal foothold before the town meeting tomorrow." "We'll get the deeds," Ethan agreed, pulling his hat down low over his eyes. "And we'll let them know you speak for this ranch." The ride into Caldwell Creek was stifling. The summer heat baked the wagon trail, but Margaret sat perfectly straight, clutching her leather satchel to her chest like a shield. She wore the same plain cotton dress, freshly washed but entirely devoid of lace or ribbon. When Ethan pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the general store, the town square was bustling. Margaret stepped down, feeling the immediate prickling heat of a dozen stares. "I'll secure the horses," Ethan murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Go on inside. I'll be right behind you." Margaret pushed open the wooden door of the general store. The bell clanged loudly, announcing her arrival. Inside, the heavy scent of dried apples, lye soap, and flour hung in the air. Standing near the counter were Mildred Paxton, the store owner, and Clara Hennessy, the woman from the fairground. The moment Margaret walked in, their conversation stopped dead. Mildred's eyes swept over Margaret, a cruel, mocking gleam lighting up her face. She leaned over the counter, not bothering to lower her voice. "Well, Clara, it seems the rumors are true. The Walker Ranch has taken in a stray." Clara snapped her lace fan open, hiding a laugh behind it. "I heard she got Tom Briggs fired, goodness knows how. A woman with a face like a mud fence certainly isn't using her feminine wiles. Perhaps she practices witchcraft. Or maybe Mr. Walker is simply desperate for cheap labor. You have to be, to look at that every morning over breakfast." Margaret Arrett stood in the center of the aisle. The familiar, crushing weight of public humiliation pressed down on her lungs. Plain, ugly, unwanted. The words echoed in her skull. She wanted to turn and run. She wanted to sink into the floorboards. But she forced her hands to release her death grip on her satchel. She walked directly up to the counter, her brown eyes locking onto Mildred. "I am here to collect the supply order for the Walker Ranch," Margaret said, her voice completely devoid of a tremor. "And to close the outstanding credit line. Mr. Walker will be paying in cash from now on." Mildred sneered, slamming a heavy sack of flour onto the counter. "You listen to me, you plain little spinster. You might have wormed your way into a broken man's house, But don't think you can walk into my store and act like you belong. You're nothing but a... The bell above the door didn't just ring. It screamed as the heavy oak door was violently shoved open. Ethan Walker filled the frame. He didn't just walk into the store. He consumed the space. The air pressure seemed to drop as he moved down the aisle, his boots thudding against the wooden floorboards with the heavy, deliberate cadence of a predator. He stopped right beside Margaret, his massive frame physically shielding her from the women at the counter. Clara Hennessy took a terrified step back, her fan dropping to the floor. Mildred's sneer vanished, replaced by a pale, breathless panic. Ethan Walker was terrifying on a good day. Today, his steel-gray eyes were practically burning. Ethan reached into his wool vest, pulled out a thick wad of cash, and slammed it down on the counter so hard the glass jars rattled. "That covers the supplies," Ethan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, lethal whisper that carried to every corner of the silent store. "And it covers the cost of closing my account permanently. If I ever hear you speak to Miss Doyle like that again, if I catch so much as a whisper of her name in your mouth, I will buy this store out from under you and burn it to the ground. Am I understood?" Mildred couldn't speak. She could only nod rapidly, her hands shaking as she pulled the money across the counter. Ethan turned his back on them, dismissing their very existence. He looked down at Margaret, the lethal fury in his eyes instantly melting into something fiercely protective. "Do you have what you need?" Margaret swallowed hard, staring up at him. No one had ever defended her. No one had ever stood between her and the town's cruelty. "Yes," she whispered. "Good. We have a meeting at the bank." He placed a hand lightly, respectfully, on the small of her back, guiding her out of the suffocating store and back into the sunlight. But the relief was short-lived. 15 minutes later, standing inside the Caldwell Creek Bank, the true depth of Charles Whitmore's trap was revealed. The bank manager, sweating profusely under Ethan's glare, handed over the ledger. "I'm sorry, Mr. Walker. Whitmore moved faster than we anticipated. He didn't just buy up the individual ranch debts. Yesterday afternoon, he purchased the debt on the communal grazing land. He holds the deed to the water access." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. She quickly scanned the documents. "The town meeting tomorrow. It's not a negotiation. It's an ambush. He controls the water. If the other ranchers don't sell their land to him, he will cut off their herds to die of thirst." "And there's more," the manager stammered, looking fearfully at Margaret. "Whitmore told the town council that the only reason he is forcing this issue is because the Walker Ranch refused to cooperate. He's telling everyone that you, Miss Doyle, manipulated the numbers to save Walker while letting the rest of the town burn." Whitmore wasn't just trying to steal the land. He was weaponizing the town's existing hatred and prejudice against Margaret, setting her up to be the scapegoat for their financial ruin. Tomorrow, in front of the entire county, they were going to tear the ugly accountant to pieces. The wagon ride back to the Walker Ranch was suffocatingly quiet. The golden Montana sun beat down relentlessly, but Margaret felt only a deep, paralyzing cold settling into her bones. Charles Whitmore wasn't just a greedy land speculator. He was a master of human cruelty. He had assessed Caldwell Creek, identified the town's deepest prejudices, and weaponized them. He knew the town would never blame a wealthy, polished man from the East for their ruin. It was far easier to blame the plain, unadorned outsider, They were already primed to hate her. To them, she was a bitter, ugly spinster who had manipulated the feared mountain man. Whitmore was going to feed her to the wolves, and the town would eagerly tear her apart. When the wagon rolled to a halt in the ranch yard, Margaret didn't wait for Ethan. She climbed down, clutching her leather satchel so tightly her fingers ached, and walked straight into the house. She didn't go to the study. She walked straight through the kitchen, out the back door, and kept walking until she reached the wooden fence lining the south pasture. The vast, rolling prairie stretched out before her, bathed in the amber light of late afternoon. She gripped the rough timber of the top rail, bowing her head. For the first time since she had arrived in this brutal territory, a single, hot tear broke free, tracking through the dust on her cheek. It wasn't the threat of losing the land that broke her composure. It was the crushing, inescapable reality of her existence. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how much intelligence or integrity she possessed, the world would only ever see a face they deemed unworthy. Whitmore had known exactly where to strike. Behind her, the crunch of heavy boots on dry grass signaled Ethan's approach. He didn't speak immediately. He just came to stand beside her, his massive presence blocking the harsh wind coming off the plains. Margaret hurriedly wiped her cheek with the back of her grease-stained cuff, desperate to hide her weakness. She straightened her spine, forcing the professional mask back into place. "You need to fire me, Mr. Walker," Margaret said. Her voice was strained, but the logic was perfectly structured. "If you arrive at the town meeting tomorrow and announce that you have dismissed me due to financial misconduct, Whitmore's narrative collapses. He won't be able to turn the town against you. You can negotiate for the water rights from a position of strength without the burden of my reputation dragging you down." Ethan turned his head slowly to look at her. His steel-gray eyes were dark, churning with a quiet, terrifying intensity. "Is that what you think I'm going to do?" "It is the only mathematically sound strategy," Margaret insisted, staring blindly out at the grass. "They hate me, Ethan. They always have. Whitmore is just giving them permission to act on it. If I stand up there tomorrow, they won't listen to a single number I present. They will only see an ugly woman who doesn't know her place. You cannot save this ranch if you are standing next to me." Margaret. He rarely used her first name. The deep, gravelly resonance of it made her breath catch. Ethan stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his wool vest. He reached out, his large, rough hands gently but firmly gripping her shoulders, turning her to face him. "Look at me," he commanded softly. She hesitated, terrified of what he would see, but the gentle pressure of his hands compelled her. She looked up into his weathered, hard-set face. "5 years ago," Ethan began, his voice dropping to a low, raw murmur, "the woman I was supposed to marry walked out 3 days before the wedding. She told everyone I was too harsh, too wild, too damaged to love, and the town agreed. They looked at me and saw a monster, so I built a wall around this ranch, and I let them believe it. I hated them for their superficiality, for the way they judge a person's worth by how well they smile and how pretty they look." His thumb slowly brushed over the tension in her shoulders. "I have watched you for weeks," Ethan said, his eyes locking onto hers with absolute, unwavering certainty. "I have watched you take every cruel whisper, every insult, and every mocking laugh this town has thrown at you, and I have watched you stand taller. You didn't hide. You fought for my land. You protected my home. You are the bravest person I have ever met." Margaret's breath shuddered. "Ethan, I don't care what they think," he interrupted, his voice hardening into absolute steel. "I didn't build this ranch to let a slick Eastern thief or a bunch of gossiping hens tell me who I can trust. Whitmore thinks you're a weakness. He's a fool. I don't see a plain woman, Margaret. I see a warrior, and I am not throwing you to the wolves." He moved one hand from her shoulder, his calloused fingers gently brushing the stray lock of light brown hair behind her ear. The touch was incredibly tender, a shocking contrast to the violent, dangerous man he was capable of being. "Tomorrow," Ethan said, "we walk into that church together. You bring your ledgers. You bring the truth. And if anyone in that room tries to silence you, they will have to go through me first." Margaret stared up at him. The wall of isolation she had built around her own heart cracked, splitting wide open. He didn't pity her. He didn't look past her face to tolerate her. He looked directly at her and saw someone worth standing beside. "Okay," she whispered, her voice trembling but her chin lifting with renewed, fierce determination. "Okay." That night the study burned with lamplight until 3 in the morning. Margaret did not cry again. She worked with the cold, ruthless precision of an executioner. She pulled every territorial statute on communal water rights, cross-referenced Whitmore's previous land acquisitions in other counties, and built a fortress of undeniable mathematics. Ethan sat in the corner chair, wide awake, cleaning and oiling his Winchester rifle with methodical calm. They didn't need to speak. The silence between them had become a vow. Friday morning dawned gray and heavy, the air thick with impending rain. Margaret washed her face, pinned her hair back into its severe bun, and put on her faded cotton dress. She picked up her heavy leather satchel. It felt like a shield. Ethan was waiting by the wagon. He wore a clean flannel shirt and his dark wool vest, his revolver strapped securely to his hip. He looked at her, nodded once, and offered his hand. For the first time in her life, Margaret took it. His grip was solid, pulling her up onto the bench. The ride into town felt like a march to the gallows. When they pulled into the dirt lot outside the Caldwell Creek Church, the community hall was already packed. Horses and wagons lined the street. Dozens of ranchers, their wives, and the town merchants milled around the entrance. As Ethan helped Margaret down from the wagon, the chatter died. Every head turned. Hundreds of eyes locked onto the small, unadorned woman and the towering, feared mountain man. Margaret could see Clara Hennessy whispering to Mildred Paxton, their eyes gleaming with malicious anticipation. Charles Whitmore stood near the church doors, flanked by 2 armed enforcers, a smug, victorious smile plastered across his face. The Crucible was waiting. Margaret tightened her grip on her satchel, squared her shoulders, and walked straight toward the church doors. Ethan Walker fell in step right beside her, his hand resting on the butt of his revolver, his eyes daring any man in the crowd to speak a single word. The inside of the Caldwell Creek Church smelled of dry pine, old hymnals, and the nervous sweat of 100 terrified ranchers. Every pew was packed tight. Men stood shoulder to shoulder along the timber walls, their faces drawn with the anxiety of impending ruin. At the front, the town commissioner sat behind a heavy oak table, wiping his brow with a handkerchief. When Ethan and Margaret walked through the heavy double doors, the low murmur of anxious conversation died instantly. Margaret kept her chin level, her eyes fixed entirely on the front of the room. She could feel the stairs dragging across her skin like coarse grit. As they walked down the center aisle, the whispers flared up like dry brush catching fire. "Brought his little stray right into the church," Clara Hennessy muttered from the third row, leaning in to whisper to Mildred Paxton. "She looks worse in the light," Mildred whispered back, her voice carrying the malicious edge of a knife. "Not a drop of grace on her. It's a wonder the man doesn't cover the mirrors in his house." Margaret's knuckles turned bone white around the handle of her leather satchel. She forced herself to breathe, to count her steps, to retreat into the safe, sterile world of mathematics. He walked half a step behind her, his sheer size acting as a physical barrier against the crowd, his gray eyes scanning the pews with a silent, lethal warning that made the whispering women quickly snap their fans open to hide their faces. They took their seats near the front. Charles Whitmore was already standing near the commissioner's table, looking out over the crowd with the magnanimous smile of a savior who had already bought the cross. "Friends, neighbors," Whitmore began, his voice practiced, smooth and resonant. "We all know why we are here. The drought has been hard. The cattle prices have been unforgiving, and unfortunately, the communal grazing land, the very lifeblood of your herds, has fallen into default. I hold that debt now. I didn't come here to ruin you. I came here to offer a way out. Sell me your parcels at the fair market rate I've proposed, and you walk away with cash in your pockets. Fight me, and the water access is shut off by sunset." A desperate, angry murmur rolled through the church. Men looked at their boots. Women clutched their shawls. They were beaten, and they knew it. Margaret stood up. She didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for the commissioner to introduce her. She simply stood, carrying her heavy ledger, and walked to the front of the room. She placed the book onto the oak table with a heavy, authoritative thud. "The market rate Mr. Whitmore is proposing is a lie," Margaret said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it possessed a ringing, bell-like clarity that cut cleanly through the stifling heat of the room. Every eye in the church snapped to the plain, unadorned woman in the faded cotton dress. Whitmore's smile tightened. "Commissioner, are we allowing outsiders to interrupt official town business?" "I am the financial manager of the Walker Ranch, representing the largest landholding in this county," Margaret stated, ignoring Whitmore entirely and addressing the crowd. "Mr. Whitmore is offering you 20 cents on the dollar for your land. What he is failing to mention is the confirmed federal filing for the Northern Pacific Railroad expansion. The tracks are projected to run directly through the Valley Basin within 18 months. The moment that route is made public, your land will quadruple in value. He is buying your water debt to force a panic sale before the railroad checks arrive." The church erupted. Ranchers shouted, jumping to their feet, demanding answers. The sudden revelation of the railroad hit the room like a lightning strike. Margaret opened her ledger, her finger tracing the precise, undeniable figures she had spent 3 nights calculating, ready to show them exactly how to legally restructure the grazing debt and freeze Whitmore's claim. For a moment, she was winning. The mathematics were flawless. The trap was broken. Whitmore saw the crowd turning. He saw his fortune slipping through his fingers, dismantled by a woman he had dismissed as a piece of ugly furniture. His face flushed with dark, vicious rage. If he couldn't beat the numbers, he knew exactly how to beat the woman presenting them. He knew Caldwell Creek. "Silence!" Whitmore bellowed, slamming his fist onto the table. The crowd quieted, caught off guard by his sudden ferocity. Whitmore turned slowly, looking Margaret up and down with an expression of such profound, exaggerated disgust that it made her stomach drop. "Are you honestly going to listen to this?" Whitmore asked, turning his sneer toward the crowd, his voice dripping with condescension. "Are you going to risk your families, your homes, your livelihoods on the desperate, fabricated math of a woman like this?" He gestured wildly at Margaret, stepping closer to her, forcing her to stand perfectly still under the harsh scrutiny of the entire town. "Look at her," Whitmore mocked, his voice echoing off the timber roof. "Truly, look at her. A homely, unwanted spinster who drifted into this territory with nothing but the clothes on her back. Do you really believe she possesses the financial genius to outmaneuver Eastern banks? Or is it far more likely that she is exactly what she looks like? A desperate, plain little stray who had to invent a fairy tale about railroads just to convince a broken, grieving rancher to keep her in his house?" Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. The ledgers under her hands suddenly felt completely useless. "We all know what she is," Whitmore pressed, twisting the knife, appealing directly to the town's coolest gossips. "She couldn't catch a husband in a civilized city, so she crawled out here, using her ledgers as an excuse to warm Ethan Walker's bed. She is manipulating him, and now she is trying to manipulate you. Are you going to lose your water rights over the lies of an ugly, scheming woman trying to secure her meal ticket?" From the third row, Clara Hennessy let out a sharp, mocking laugh. It was the spark that caught the dry brush. The tension in the room shattered into cruel, ugly laughter. The men who had just been listening to her math now looked at her with disdain. The women whispered behind their hands. The word echoed in her mind, deafening and absolute. Ugly. 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 Margaret stood frozen at the front of the church. The room spun. The old familiar terror swallowed her whole. This was her nightmare made real. Her intelligence, her integrity, her relentless hard work, none of it mattered. To the world, she was just a plain face, a joke, a pathetic creature stepping out of her place. She closed her eyes, her shoulders trembling, the humiliation crushing the breath from her lungs. She had lost. And then the heavy wooden pew in the second row groaned loudly as a massive frame stood up. The laughter didn't just stop, it died a sudden, violently abrupt death. Ethan Walker stepped into the center aisle. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the co-missiona. His steel-gray eyes were locked onto Charles Whitmore with a terrifying, absolute promise of destruction. The heavy thud of Ethan Walker's boots against the timber floorboards sounded like the steady, inevitable beat of a war drum. He moved down the center aisle of the church with a slow, lethal grace. The men who had been standing shoulder to shoulder frantically scrambled out of his way, pressing themselves against the pews. Charles Whitmore's smug, victorious smile evaporated. The Eastern investor took an involuntary step backward, the color draining from his face, as he realized that all his money and all his polished words meant absolutely nothing in the face of a mountain man who had just decided to kill him. Ethan reached the front of the room. He didn't look at the crowd. He bypassed Whitmore entirely and stopped directly in front of Margaret. She was trembling. The echoes of the town's laughter, the venomous word ugly, slung at her like a stone, had nearly brought her to her knees. She looked up at Ethan, her brown eyes bright with unshed tears, fully expecting him to guide her out the back door, to hide her away from the humiliation. Instead, Ethan reached out. In front of the entire breathless congregation, he took her small, trembling hand in his massive, calloused one. The warmth of his grip was an anchor in a raging storm. He stepped slightly in front of her, turning his terrifying gaze upon Charles Whitmore. "You have exactly 3 seconds to get out of my sight," Ethan said. His voice was a low, guttural rasp that carried to the very back of the church. "Before I tear you apart with my bare hands." Whitmore swallowed hard, his eyes darting to his 2 armed enforcers. But the enforcers, looking at the sheer size and absolute murderous intent radiating from the cowboy, wisely kept their hands far away from their holsters. "You can't threaten me, Walker," Whitmore stammered, trying to project a false bravado. "The whole town sees it now. She's nothing but a desperate, homely spinster clinging to you for survival. Are you really going to throw away this town's future for a woman who—" "Stop." The word didn't come from Ethan. It came from Margaret. She squeezed Ethan's hand, stepping out from behind his protective shadow. Her trembling had ceased. The crushing weight of the humiliation was still there, but as she looked at Ethan, at the man who was willing to wage war against the entire world just to shield her, the fear burned away, leaving only a fierce, blinding clarity. She turned to face Charles Whitmore, and then her gaze swept over the silent, staring crowd. Clara Hennessy, Mildred Paxton, the men who had mocked her, the women who had pitied her. "You are right, Mr. Whitmore," Margaret said, her voice steady, ringing through the breathless church. "I am plain. I am not beautiful by your standards, or by the standards of the women in this town. I have been told my entire life that my face makes me unwanted, that my lack of grace makes me a burden." The townspeople shifted uncomfortably in their pews. Hearing the cruel truth spoken aloud, stripped of their gossiping whispers, suddenly made it sound incredibly ugly. Margaret took a step forward, her chin lifted high. "But my plain face didn't forge delivery receipts to steal from this ranch. My plain face didn't conspire to buy up communal water rights to choke this town into submission. And my plain face didn't sit by in silence while a wealthy thief tried to steal the homes of every family sitting in this room." She slammed her hand down onto the heavy ledger on the table. "I spent my nights working until my fingers bled to fix your broken ledgers," Margaret declared, her voice filled with a raw, undeniable power. "I saved half the ranches in this county while you stood in your general stores and laughed at the dust on my dress. I did it because it was right. I did it because mathematics doesn't care if you are pretty or if you are popular. It only cares about the truth." Margaret turned slowly, her eyes leaving the crowd and locking entirely onto Ethan. Her breath hitched, but she did not look away. This was the precipice, the confession she had buried deep in her chest. "And as for manipulating Mr. W. Walker," Margaret continued, her voice softening, trembling with a raw, terrifying vulnerability, "I didn't have to manipulate him, because for the first time in my life, a man looked at me and didn't see an ugly woman. He saw me. He protected me when he owed me nothing. He treated my mind with respect and my heart with dignity." A tear finally spilled over her lashes, but she stood incredibly tall. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore, I love him," Margaret confessed, the words echoing in the silent church. "I love this silent, broken cowboy who has more honor in his little finger than you possess in your entire soul. I love him knowing he owes me nothing. I love him knowing I am plain. And I don't care if the whole town laughs at me for it, because I would rather be the ugly woman standing beside Ethan Walker than the most beautiful woman standing with any of you." The church was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop on the timber floorboards. The town expected Ethan to be embarrassed. They expected the rugged, solitary mountain man to pull away from the desperate spinster, making a public spectacle of her unrequited feelings. Instead, Ethan Walker did something that shocked them to their very core. He didn't just step toward her. He reached out with both hands, gently cupping Margaret's face, his thumbs wiping away the single tear on her cheek. He looked down at her with an expression of such profound, earth-shattering reverence that it made Clara Hennessy gasp audibly in the third row. Then Ethan turned his head to look at the stunned congregation. "You blind, foolish people," Ethan said, his voice echoing with a fierce, unwavering pride. "You look at her and you see someone plain. I look at her and I see the only beautiful thing left in this miserable territory." He wrapped a massive arm around Margaret's waist, pulling her flush against his side, publicly and undeniably claiming her in front of every soul who had ever mocked her. "She is the bravest woman I have ever known," Ethan declared, his eyes locking onto Whitmore, then sweeping over Mildred and Clara. "She fought for your land while you laughed at her clothes. She is not a stray. She is not a spinster. She is Margaret Doyle, and as soon as the circuit judge rides through Caldwell Creek, she is going to be my wife." A collective, stunned gasp rippled through the pews. Margaret's breath left her lungs in a rush. She stared up at Ethan, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. He was looking down at her, the dark, protective shadows in his gray eyes replaced entirely by a warm, undeniable light. Charles Whitmore, realizing that his social assassination had backfired spectacularly, let out a vicious, desperate snarl. "How touching," Whitmore spat, his face pale with fury. He reached into his tailored coat and pulled out a thick, legal document, stamped with a red territorial seal. "But love won't save her from tea." "Law. I didn't just come here with property deeds, Walker. I brought an injunction from the territorial magistrate in Helena. Miss Doyle's former employer died deep in debt to my associates. Under territorial law, her accounting license is hereby suspended, and any financial restructuring she has done for the Walker Ranch or anyone else in this town is legally null and void." Whitmore slammed the document onto the table next to the ledger. "She has no authority." Whitmore smiled, a cold, venomous grin. "The numbers mean nothing. The water rights are mine. And by Monday morning, the local sheriff will be arresting your beautiful bride for practicing financial law without a valid license." The crowd erupted into chaos once more. Whitmore had played his final, most devastating card. He couldn't break Margaret's spirit, so he was going to destroy her freedom.